Good morning. It's Wednesday, July 31st. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 299 days old. I'm Jonathan Schanzer, Senior Vice President for Research at Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief. Wow, do we have a lot to unpack from yesterday and even a little bit from today? I thought it was big news when the U.S. fired on Shiite militias in Iraq, but that wasn't even close to the big news. The Israelis finally struck back after that Hezbollah attack that killed 12 children on Saturday. The IDF hit a building in the Beirut suburb known as Dahia, which is Hezbollah's stronghold, and they killed one of the top military figures of the group. His name was Fuad Shukr. Then a few hours later, the Israelis took out Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Iran. Talk about a shift in momentum. I'm hearing this morning that there are explosions in the area of Damascus, possibly an IRGC leader taken out in that strike. We're going to talk about all of this live in just a few seconds here on the FDD Morning Brief. Our guest this morning is Aviva Klompas. She is the co-founder and CEO of a terrific organization called Boundless, which fights anti-Semitism online, conducts opinion polling, produces important research, and more. She's a former speechwriter for the Israeli mission to the UN in New York, and she's the author of a new book called Stand Up Nation, Israeli Resilience in the Wake of Disaster. We'll talk to Aviva about her book and much more in just a few minutes here live on the FDD Morning Brief. Fuad Shukr, a top commander of the Iran-backed terrorist group Hezbollah, met his maker yesterday in Lebanon. The IDF made that introduction. Shukr had it coming. He was responsible for the murder of 12 Druze teenagers in the town of Majd al-Shams on Saturday. He was responsible for countless other attacks against Israel over the years. But Shukr was even worse than most people realize. He was responsible for the October 1983 Marine barracks bombing. It was a suicide truck bombing that killed 241 American service members, including 220 Marines, 18 sailors, and 3 soldiers. It was the bloodiest terrorist attack against Americans until September 11th. Shukr has been under U.S. sanctions since 2015. The State Department later added him to the Rewards for Justice program, putting a $5 million bounty on his head. And yet, there were no high fives from the White House yesterday. If anything, the White House appeared deeply concerned about the liquidation of Shukr. I get it. The White House doesn't want a wider war. The Israelis don't want one either, but they have been attacked incessantly since October 8th by Iran's top proxy in Lebanon. They finally did what needed to be done. I don't think there will be any public thank yous, and nobody in Israel will get that State Department bounty, but I think it's fair to say that justice was served. My guess, after hearing the news yesterday, more than a few Marines let out a full-throated "Oorah." I know I did. But wait, there's more. Let's talk about the liquidation of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Iran last night. Hamas has suffered several meaningful decapitations since 10/7. The first was Salah al-Aruri. The Israelis took him out in Lebanon on January 2nd of this year. Aruri was a key political and military figure for the group. Then on March 10th, the Israelis targeted Marwan Issa, the deputy commander of the Izzadin al-Qassam brigades, the self-described military wing of Hamas. On July 13th, the IDF took out Issa's boss, Mohammed Deif, the top military commander of Hamas, as he tried to hide among Palestinians seeking refuge from the destructive war that he directed. With the death of these 3 plus Haniyeh last night, Hamas is in trouble. The top leadership is thinning out. Who's left? There's Qatar-based Khalid Meshal, a Hamas leader whose star is fading. His only real claim to fame is that Israel attempted to assassinate him in Jordan in 1997. The other is Yahya Sinwar, the man who single-handedly launched this war and who could end it by surrendering and handing over the remaining hostages. Sinwar is currently hiding in a Gaza tunnel, and a tunnel is likely where he will meet his end. Between the demise of the Hamas leadership and the loss of more than 2/3 of its fighting force in Gaza, Hamas is reeling. It ain't over yet, but Israel has pinpoint intelligence and a long reach. The gloves are finally off, and if you ask me, that is probably a good thing. Now for your headlines. Headline 1, Iran's oil industry is alive and well. According to the regime's customs agency, Iran exported $15.7 billion worth of oil and $7.7 billion worth of petrochemicals between March and July of this year. A lot of that oil went to China, and a lot of that revenue went straight into the coffers of Iran's terror proxies. Not to sound like a broken record, but this is on the Biden administration. Team Biden's lax approach to Iran has allowed the regime to ramp up its illicit oil exports over the last 3 years. Iran exported approximately 1.4 million barrels of oil per day in June 2024, compared to less than 390,000 barrels per day in June 2019. The numbers just don't lie. Maximum pressure works, appeasement doesn't. It's really that simple. Headline 2. The UK is weighing an arms embargo against Israel. It's not a done deal, despite calls from the UK's Labour Party for a blanket ban on weapon shipments to Israel. London will now investigate evidence of purported Israeli war crimes and then suspend export licenses for weapons it can link to those alleged crimes. That could take weeks, according to British media. Britain's arms sales to Israel are relatively humble. They totaled just over $23 million last year, but the potential embargo is another indicator of Britain's recent anti-Israel backslide. Since the Labour Party ousted the Conservatives in the UK's July 4th elections, Britain restored funding to UNRWA and withdrew its objection to the International Criminal Court's request for arrest warrants against Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. They just don't get it. Israel is on the front lines of a war to defend their way of life, our way of life. This is not exactly the thank you the Israelis were looking for. Headline 3, Iran has officially inaugurated its new president, Masoud Pezeshkian. To recap, former Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi died in a helicopter crash in May. Iran held sham elections in June that led to sham runoffs in July. Pezeshkian, the so-called reformist candidate, emerged victorious. He was sworn in yesterday. The ceremony was a real anti-Western hate fest. Tehran's A-list guests included the late Hamas political chief Ismail Haniyeh, that has a nice ring to it, Islamic Jihad leader Ziad al-Nahla, who survived the attack last night, and Hezbollah Deputy Secretary Naim Qassem and Houthi spokesman Mohammed Abdul Salam. Pezeshkian's inauguration was greeted with chants of death to America and death to Israel. Don't you love it when the so-called experts in Washington tell you that the foreign policy of the Islamic Republic is nuanced and complex? Okay, it's now time for my interview with Aviva Klompas, a former speechwriter for the Israeli mission to the UN. Aviva is now the co-founder and CEO of a nonprofit called Boundless. Aviva does great work on social media, and she is an author of 2 books, including her latest, Stand Up Nation, Israeli Resilience in the Wake of Disaster. Let's talk to her live right now on the FDD Morning Brief. Good morning, Aviva Klompas.
It is a good morning indeed, Jonathan. It's nice to be here with you.
Great to have you. Well, let's talk about last night. What's your assessment of the fallout, of how this is going to be read by the Arab world, by the Iranians, by the Iranian axis? Taking out Ismail Haniyeh is no joke, huh?
Absolutely not. And I think this may still be in motion. We saw that there was the strike in Beirut. We saw the strike in Tehran, and there were reports just a short while ago about a strike in Damascus, Syria. So events may still be unfolding as we go, but let's talk about the 2 that we know about. Israel's military and intelligence have pulled off an unbelievable coup, first in taking out the second in command of Hezbollah, as you said, and of course, taking out the head of Hamas in Tehran. And you have to imagine that Iranian leaders and proxy leaders are looking over their shoulders and feeling a little bit more uncomfortable, probably for the first time in 10 months. And now the big question is, what is next? What I find so interesting about what's going on is the calculated nature of these strikes. Israel is so often accused of attacking indiscriminately, but really what we've seen over the last 24 hours is the precise and pinpoint nature of these attacks and the incredible amount of restraint. You know, I was in Israel back in April when Iran launched over 300 drones and ballistic missiles, and I was standing at Hostage Square when the announcement came through. It was about 9 p.m., and the announcement was that everybody needs to be back home and sheltering by 11 p.m. And we saw yesterday after the strike in Beirut that Home Front Command immediately put out a statement taking responsibility. The IDF put out a statement and said there's no changes to Home Front Command, meaning that when Israel is making these strikes and calculations and these counterattacks are taking place, it's almost like there's a pre-calculation done to know what the tit for tat is going to be. But we've never really seen it in a sequence like what we're seeing playing out right now over these 24 hours. I think the real question has to do with the issue of deterrence. The philosophy of Israel's war from the very beginning, going back to David Ben-Gurion, has been based on two principles. One, not to fight long wars, and two, to maintain deterrence. Well, we haven't seen that play out since October 7th. It's 10 months in the making with no end in sight. You have tens of thousands of Israelis unable to return to their homes in the north and the south. You have more than 100 Israelis still held hostage. The last 24 hours have probably blown up any attempt at a hostage deal. And so that notion of a limited, small war, contained war, that's definitely off the table. And now the question is around deterrence. Israel has proven its ability to take out incredibly senior leaders, to strike right into the heart of its greatest enemies. And is that enough to really reverse the situation of everything that I've described in terms of restoring security to the Israeli people, bringing our hostages home, and allowing people to return to their homes? And it doesn't appear to be so.
I tend to agree with your analysis. I mean, I think I might quibble with one thing, and that is that it actually looks to me anyway like Hamas is now a shell of itself. I mean, when you think about the fact that Daif is now gone, that Marwan Issa is gone, that Arouri is gone, that Ismail Haniyeh is gone, and Sinwar's stuck underground, he can't stick his head out. It certainly looks like Hamas is reeling, and we could potentially see an end of major combat operations there. That's the good news. The bad news is that it looks like things are heating up in the north, and that's really what I want to ask you about right now. What's happening up there? Do you think we are on the edge of a major war, a very different kind of war than what we've been seeing in Gaza, and what does that mean for Israel?
Yeah, I would say the way in which I measure success in terms of what's happening in this war has more to do with what's happening to Israel and its people than to its enemies. Meaning, to what sense do Israelis feel a sense of security? In what sense do they feel a sense of confidence in their government, in their country? And that has been obviously shattered since October 7th and has not been restored, even with the small victories. And I say small because in the scope of what we've seen in 10 months, we've seen a few small victories like the last 24 hours, the rescuing of some limited amount of hostages. But in the big scale, we're still in a very depressed position, particularly when it comes to the north. Hezbollah has managed to make Israel smaller without standing on an inch of Israeli land. They have prevented tens of thousands of Israelis to be able to live in their home. We saw 12 children murdered on Saturday. We saw another Israeli citizen murdered just yesterday from a Hezbollah attack. And so, yes, I think that this is an untenable situation. It is not possible that this will be the new normal. And so I think it does seem inevitable that the situation in the north will continue to escalate. Now, that said, throughout the entire 10 months, we've seen that the American administration, I believe, has been putting on the brakes, holding Israel to a lot of restraint and preventing it from being able to do what it wanted to do. We know that Israel's defense minister wanted to take out Hezbollah much sooner in this war, but wasn't allowed to do so. And I think the question is, especially given the American election coming up and domestic politics, is to what extent is the United States still going to be able to restrain Israel?
I think that's right. And I got to say that after last night, it doesn't look like there's a lot of restraint being put on the Israelis. And by the way, that may be what Israel needs. It might be even what the United States needs right now, that, America's continued restraint of Israel. We've been watching. Hezbollah has said that they revel in this. The Iranians are reveling in it. So if it looks like the gloves are off, maybe they'll be chastened by what they see. And that, I think, is probably a good thing. Real quick, though, I do want to ask you, I know you kind of keep a finger on the pulse of what's going on in Israel. I know that it's been demoralizing over the last several months. The Israelis are fighting what looks like a war of attrition on multiple fronts. But do you think that last night changed anything in terms of the morale of the Israelis? Do you think this is the kind of thing that will kind of, inject some energy and perhaps revive the Israeli public as they have to look toward potentially an exhausting second front?
Yeah, I think it's a complicated question. The first thought that I had when I saw that Haniyeh was taken out was, I hope I'm still alive when the movie based on declassified intelligence comes out. because it's going to be an unbelievable film. So absolutely, there's been a burst in confidence and a burst in joy from Israelis. We've seen them out on the streets celebrating, because this really is a triumph of Israeli military and intelligence. But at the same time, all the problems that existed yesterday are still there. And there's a deep sense of exhaustion. This is not a country that is meant to be at war for almost a year. It's based on the reserves. The economy is crippled when you have this many soldiers called up. You have deep demoralization. You, of course, have the divides within Israeli society. We saw what was happening at the prison in the last 24 hours. There's a deep, deep sense of exhaustion. And now the anxiety that's lingered over Israel for the last 10 months is now escalated as we wait to see what comes next. The second thought that I have after I hope I get to see the movie is that my heart is broken for the families of the hostages. It is hard to imagine that the hostage deal, which seemed promising a week ago, we can say promising about this, seems it's likely off the table right now. And now we're desperate again to get our 111 citizens back.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is probably a question as to whether military pressure like this could force a surrender. But I think you're right. I think the hopes are fading. They probably were fading before this attack, but maybe now it's completely off the table. I want to ask you, just for the benefit of our audience, if you could tell us just a little bit about Boundless, the organization that you run with our friend Rachel Fish.
Absolutely. I'm so proud to be the co-founder of Boundless along with my good friend Rachel Fish. Boundless is a think action tank. We are studying issues that relate to Israel and anti-Semitism. Rachel's purview happens to be over the educational. She is, I believe, the foremost educator of Israel and anti-Semitism in North America. And she's reimagining what Israel education looks like, developing new frameworks, working quite a lot with universities, administrators, professors, K-12 educators. And I'm focused on the narrative war, which means trying to figure out what exactly is going wrong for us, both in mainstream media as well as social media, some of the more technical elements that have to do with algorithmic manipulation, bot activity, the echo chambers, but also how we can more effectively message and communicate about issues of importance to us. And that means figuring out who are the most important audiences that we need to be able to talk to. How do we identify them? What are their knowledge, attitudes, and opinions about issues of Israel and anti-Semitism? And then how can we cut through this noise and more effectively communicate with them?
Sounds like important work. And speaking of which, speaking of important work, you have a second book out. The first was about being a speechwriter at Israel's UN mission, if I'm not mistaken, in New York. And this one is called Stand Up Nation. Tell us about that.
Absolutely. This is my new book. I'm very proud of it. My first book was called Speaking for Israel, and it is a memoir about my experience being the speechwriter for Israel at the United Nations. It's a look behind the scenes of what it is to be in the heart of the belly of the United Nations, the most anti-Israel institution in the world. And my second book, Stand Up Nation, is actually really an outgrowth from that experience. Israel had, at the time, still has, I believe, one speechwriter at the United Nations, and the UN covers an enormous breadth of topics. So I didn't often have a lot of time to get into in-depth research on all the issues that I had to write about. But when it came to writing about international development, I always found that I was falling down a rabbit hole, reading more and more about this interesting history that Israel has. Israel was a developing country itself in the 1950s when it founds an international development agency. The Israel that we know today looks nothing like Israel in its earliest years. It was on the brink of economic collapse. People were living in mabarot, which were essentially shanty towns. There was a ministry of rationing because goods had to be rationed because they were so limited. It was not a land of milk and honey. It was swamps and dry desert. And out of this, in this context, Israel actually manages to found an international development agency. It has one before the United States, before Canada, before the UN has United Nations Development Program, and it becomes one of the first countries in the world to offer its hand in friendship and assistance to other countries. So in Stand Up Nation, I tell the story of how that came to be, and then I jump to the present day, and I feature about 20 different Israelis who are entrepreneurs that have founded amazing organizations that are doing international development and humanitarian relief works, including Israelis who go into countries where Israel has no political or diplomatic relations in order to provide assistance to them, and also unbelievable stories in agriculture and solar power and clean water and healthcare and so forth. And especially in the time that we're living in right now, I submitted the manuscript for Stand Up Nation about 6 weeks before October 7th. And then I rewrote the introduction and some of the chapters in light of the attack that had been going on. And I think that there's a lesson to us, because even right now, as we're asking what comes next, we have to remember that this isn't the first time that Israel found itself isolated, demonized on the world stage, being threatened with boycotts, with military boycotts, with legal action and so forth. This is the same context that Israel found itself in its earliest years. And what Israel has always understood, what the Jewish people have always understood, is that we are the author of our own story. Sure, Hamas wrote a chapter in our book on October 7th, but other than that, we are the ones that are going to be the author of what the rest of this story looks like. We won't be dictated to by others. And that's really the story of Stand Up Nation.
Well, I look forward to reading it. Congratulations on having it come out at a pretty amazing time in the history of Israel. We'll leave it there. Thank you, Aviva Klompas, for joining us live today on the FDD Morning Brief.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Well, here's what FDD has on tap for you today. We're going to keep watching that news, and I think we're going to be blanketing the coverage. But in the meantime, my colleague Seth Frantzman has just published a new book as well. It's called The October 7th War, Israel's Battle for Security in Gaza. This is Seth's firsthand experience covering the war since the morning of 10/7, blending the accounts of soldiers, first responders, and civilians who survived the Hamas massacre. Seth tells the story of the commanders and soldiers who have sacrificed so much to restore security to Israel. The book is available now on Amazon, and I encourage you all to add it to your summer reading list. If you haven't had enough of me yet, you can check out two recent pieces I've written on the Hezbollah-Lebanon crisis. The first one appeared in commentary over the weekend. I look at the various escalation paths and even a few off-ramps for that conflict. The second one is co-written with my colleague David Daoud, and it appears in the Dispatch. We take a critical look at Hezbollah's faulty logic, namely that it can continue to wage war against Israel without consequences. Oh, and keep an eye out for yet another piece that I should have out later today on the meaning of last night's targeted killing of Ismail Haniyeh. No rest for the weary here. And finally, FDD Senior Fellow Sinan Jidi has a policy brief with Sophia Epley from Georgetown about Turkey's threats to invade Israel. Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Turkey's strongman, is officially unhinged, folks. He is threatening war against Israel right now, and his media is out there comparing Netanyahu to Hitler. Worst NATO ally ever? Yeah, you bet. Okay, that's going to do it for today. Read our expert analysis on our website, fdd.org. Read our quick takes on X at FDD and support our work with a tax-deductible donation at fdd.org/invest. Tune in Friday for another can't-miss episode of the FDD Morning Brief featuring our own Ruel Marc-Garect. Ruel worked for the CIA for more years than he probably cares to admit. He knows Iran, he knows Turkey, and he knows how to be very inappropriate in serious conversations. Just wait for that potty mouth. I'm sure we'll learn a few things and probably laugh out loud a little bit too. So until then, I'm Jonathan Schanzer, signing off for FDD.